Welcome to the Aligned Interior podcast, where we believe that spaces should nourish, support, and promote your mental, emotional, physical, and your spiritual well being, while also being true reflections of your most authentic self. Here we explore how the spaces we dwell in make us well and unwell, while also giving you the knowledge and the tools on how to bring you and your space into alignment, gleaning insights from acclaimed experts on the cutting edge of science and senses. I am your host, Sonia Randall, holistic interior designer and owner of the Aligned Interior. Thank you so much for being here. Let's dive in. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Aligned Interior. If you tuned in last week, you know that we are in the middle of a fascinating two-part series on neuroaesthetics, the science of how design and beauty shapes our brains, emotions, and behavior. In part one, we talked about how our brains respond to interior spaces, why we are drawn to certain design elements like curves, contrast, high ceilings, and how these preferences are rooted in both neuroscience and evolution. Today, in part two, we're going to go even deeper. We'll explore how design impacts the nervous system, creativity, and emotional regulation, often in ways that most people are not consciously aware of. Dr. Vartanian also shares some fascinating insights on biophilic design, the psychology of beauty, and importantly, the difference between fleeting pleasure that a space can evoke and deeper, lasting joy, the kind that supports authenticity, emotional balance, and overall well-being. We also dive into how thoughtfully designed spaces can act as safe environments for emotional alchemy, similar to exposure therapy, helping us to move through challenging feelings and restore inner balance. If you're curious about how spaces can facilitate healing, creativity, and meaning, or how to design spaces to facilitate nervous system regulation and brain homeostasis, you're in the right place. Let's dive into part two of Your Brain on Design with Dr. Oshin Vartanian. So, in our first conversation, we touched on the benefits of integration of nature through biophilic design. From a neuroaesthetic perspective, what specific mental health and well-being benefits can we expect when we intentionally incorporate nature into our interior environments?
Okay, so that's a very good question. I can sort of answer this from a few different perspectives. So some of the early work in this area showed that when people are they find themselves in environments that kind of represent perceptual elements from nature, there are improvements in mood and well-being. Okay, so the next kind of important question that sort of then happens, that you kind of become immediately interested in if you're interested in the brain, is whether there are regions in the brain that are sensitive to features of the environment and design that have incorporated elements from nature. And there are kind of like a few different ways to kind of go about looking at this. One of them would be, for example, whether the environment that you find yourself in kind of has actual representations of natural phenomena. So, for example, you can think about this as having a room with, like, for example, plants in it. Okay, it's kind of like very concrete, overt representation. But what's even more interesting is whether a room that you find yourself in has kind of elements of nature represented in it that are sort of not as overt as having maybe a plant in your room. Okay, so we know that there are certain kinds of perceptual features that distinguish natural phenomena from human-made phenomena. So, for example, one element you can think about from a perceptual perspective is the amount of contrast that you see. So when you look at kind of natural landscapes, they tend to have high degree of contrast, and contrast could be kind of variations in color, variations in luminance, variations in texture. And then when you look at human-made objects, for example, almost any office space that you walk into, or like furniture that's sort of made, they're much more uniform. So there's not a whole bunch of gradations of differences in what it is that you're looking at. And as it so happens, our brain is very, very sensitive to that. So a few months ago, we did this study where we had people go inside the fMRI scanner, and they were shown different images of interior architecture that kind of vary in the amount of contrast that they represent. And this could be, for example, as I mentioned, variations in color and texture, things that you can measure quantitatively. And we have regions in the brain's visual system that are very, very sensitive to that. And the nice thing about this finding is that you don't have to be overtly aware that what you're looking at is a natural object, but it can be incorporating an element from nature that your brain is already sensitive to. Another thing that's been shown in behavioral studies to be very important is what's called scaling, or levels of scale. So for example, if you look at something like a tree, or if you look at something like a landscape, you have this like beautiful kind of hierarchical gradations of scale in what you're looking at. Whereas again, in human made objects, you tend not to see that. So we again know that regions in the brain are really sensitive to that, even if you're not necessarily aware of it. Now, the follow up question that you asked is whether all of these things that are impacting the brain have kind of like a secondary effect on health outcomes. So that is something that's now a very active area of study. I think the the first question that sort of came about is, well, are there natural variables that our brain is sensitive to? Now we know that the brain is showing sensitivity to that. And really, really interestingly, from a neuroscientific perspective, it's sort of specifically different regions of the brain that are sensitive to different variables. Now, the next step will be to see whether those sensitivities, those mechanisms kind of have like secondary effects on kind of the outcomes that we kind of perhaps care about even more, which are like health and well-being.
Right. And, for our listeners, I think it's a great, now that you've kind of highlighted and expanded on that a little bit more, to kind of highlight the difference between environmental psychology and neuroaesthetics. Because we know from environmental psychology standpoint that certain features in space like biophilic design can have an effect for mental health and well-being. So I'd love it if you could just kind of speak, because I know that you're not an environmental psychologist here, but just kind of that difference so people understand that there's science-based evidence in our well-being linked to nature, but it sounds like we're just beginning to really understand the neurological components of that.
I'm really glad that you sort of mentioned environmental psychology, because even though the work that I do is kind of falls within neuroaesthetics and kind of neuroscience of architecture and design, but it's very, very heavily informed by ideas from environmental psychology. So you can almost kind of like think about this, I mean, people have used the term kind of environmental neuroscience, for example, because these areas are so overlapping, and we kind of tend to borrow and blend concepts all the time. So, for example, something that we had talked about earlier, say you are in a medical setting, for example, in a hospital
Mhm.
recovery room, and we know that, for example, having representations of nature in the room has all kinds of beneficial impacts on the people that find themselves in those spaces of recovery. So we know the effect is there, but you kind of want to know, well, what's really driving this effect? So kind of in some ways, maybe at a superficial level, you would say, well, when a person looks at a natural scene, that kind of impacts the person's well-being. And because of that kind of impact on affect, there could be kind of downstream effects on recovery and health. But to really understand the mechanism, kind of the brain becomes a very interesting place to look at, because if you can find brain processes and brain mechanisms that are both responding to the presence of biophilic features of design, that you can then link to some kind of a beneficial health outcome, that kind of completes the loop.
Exactly. Yes. No, I'm glad that we highlighted that because it is, an overlap, and I want to ensure that people are really understanding where those lines are.
There are all these effects that we know impact outcomes that we care about, but it's sometimes very, very difficult to really kind of isolate the mechanism or the process that's driving it, because, and in fact there could be many, there doesn't have to be a single process or a single mechanism, and the other thing which I think you and I also touched on last time a little bit also was the social aspect of all of these occurrences. So a lot of the environments that we find ourselves in, we tend maybe not to be in them individually. Okay. And we have all kinds of interactions with other human beings, some of which might involve kind of explicit discussions about features of the environment that we find ourselves in. And I find all of these social interactions that we have in the spaces that we find ourselves in can sometimes augment some of those beneficial effects.
Definitely. And, on this relational topic, are there any neural mechanisms that we know of that foster feelings of connection or belonging or unity through natural elements in terms of, I don't know, like fractals, or are there anything, is there anything in nature that we know that we can bring into the interior environment that can facilitate that sort of feeling?
So there's this idea that Anshan Chatterjee and I sort of like put together with Alexander Coburn a few years ago about looking at what some of the kind of basic underlying factors are that determine our preference for architecture. Okay. So this was a study that we did where we sort of looked at a very large amount of data collected from hundreds of people across multiple studies. But we also collected some imaging data to see whether there were regions in the brain that were sensitive to these factors. So what we found is that, yeah, when people are looking at kind of interior spaces, there are lots of different factors that they are sensitive to, but you can sort of boil them down to about three large scale factors. So one of them is what we call coherence, but this has been sort of talked about in the literature before. In other words, when you look at a space, does the space make sense to you?
Mhm.
Okay. So it's kind of like an organizational zoom. It's almost like a sense making activity. Then the second factor is kind of fascination. So, is there something in this space that you find interesting that's worth exploring? So, if you recall, we were talking, for example, about the fact that when people find themselves in rooms with higher ceilings, they engage in more visual spatial exploration. It could be that, for example, this affords them a greater amount of space to engage in this kind of exploratory behavior. And then the third factor is kind of hominess. Okay. The extent to which you have kind of like a warm sense of being in a space that is also a very important factor. So, and I think when people talk about that third factor, hominess, a lot of social aspects come into play, because a lot of the mental models that we have about what it is that we consider to be a cozy and home-like space, we typically accrue them through kind of social interactions over time. So I think, so at least we have one factor from the three factors that we've isolated so far where I think there is a clear entry point for kind of social cultural aspects, because our understanding of what it is that makes a space cozy and our understanding of what it is that makes a space feel homey kind of probably comes from a lot of the social interactions that we had in the past in spaces of that kind. And interestingly, of course, there's also a region in the visual system again that is sensitive to variations in that factor. So the brain is sensitive to it.
That's interesting. I'm thinking of, and I'm not sure if I'm wording this as well, but I'm thinking of, when you're in nature and sometimes you have moments. I think what I'm speaking to is a little bit more of that relational aspect of interconnectedness, but it's still relational, even though it's different than, me socializing with you and talking here. It's a connection that still happens that many people speak of. And I'm wondering if there has been any studies around that in terms of the brain, just in terms of, because that's another way of connecting that hominess that you're saying, of, that you can build on to feel interconnected with your environment and basically stepping outside of yourself. Because I know that you also mentioned, just a few moments ago, we talked about that opening up that can happen and exploratory. And what I'm hearing when I hear you say that is you're kind of stepping outside of yourself a little. You're so that you end up being less self-focused and you're more out. So then you can kind of end up having more of that feeling of expansion, but also potentially connected.
Yes. So I am not aware of neuroscientific studies on this particular question, but I am very, very sympathetic to it because, for example, if you think about how you feel when you enter, places of worship and what they're really designed to do, places of worship that you see in different kinds of culture that are sort of outdoor, you know, and you have this clearly kind of like an expanded self sense of self when you find yourself in them that are really designed to promote a feeling of kind of connectedness with something bigger than just you. Okay, so I can see a lot of incredible opportunities for exploring that and how the brain responds to that and the kind of the psychology behind how that kind of feeling manifests itself in a person. But I'm not aware of any studies that have looked at it from a neuroscientific perspective per se.
Okay, okay, because that was leading to one of my other questions was about cathedrals and places of worship. Because, they are fascinating to me in the sense of, we spoke just a few moments ago, kind of a little bit around kind of intricate patterns. So I'm speaking more to like cathedrals, but
Yeah.
in our last conversation, this speaks to that feeling of awe that can happen. And I find it fascinating that, and intricate patterns are seen in nature. So it's, there's a connection there between mosaics and different types of man-made art that can facilitate a similar feeling as nature does as well. And would this kind of speak to fractals as well in nature from a neuroaesthetic standpoint?
Yeah, yes, and of course, for fractals per se, there has been a lot of work in psychology of perception focusing specifically on fractals. But in a church setting, for example, if you think about a cathedral, the other component that's now become a major focus of study, also in environmental psychology, is this idea on kind of multisensory processing. So
Mhm.
these spaces, so there is when you, for example, go to a Catholic church, so there's of course all the visual components of what it is that you see in terms of like the variations in color and light. But of course, there's the auditory component. There's the very, very strong olfactory component. So I think
Mhm.
all of these fuse together, right? And I think all of it really is really kind of like meant to elevate that state.
Yes, and on the multisensory, you know, I'd like to touch on the fact that it's kind of controlled in that environment to a degree, in the sense that our nervous systems can process only so much information. And in terms of what's being inputted in, we can directly affect it, like we're talking about, in the brain. But if you are using the senses in an environment that's kind of all targeting to feel more relaxed, more open up, more that's going to facilitate that greater experience that we're talking about potentially for people. It'll at least, facilitate that opportunity. It doesn't necessarily mean you will have it, but I guess what I'm trying to highlight here is a lot of our environments are kind of overloaded in terms of our sensory experience, and that we process all of that through our nervous system and our brain.
Mm.
So, could you speak to your thoughts in terms of our interior environments and just kind of that, well, if there's a sweet spot really neurologically in terms of a load to help people feel a little bit more relaxed, open. I know we talked about creativity before, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So there's a few different ways to talk about this. It's kind of like opens up a whole new avenue of discussion. But something that you alluded to is kind of our looking at our kind of nervous system as sort of responding to incoming input. So we have systems in our brain that are sort of kind of evolutionarily designed to do precisely that. So, and of course, it's been very, very beneficial for us in terms of survival over time. So, but typically the problem with that is that when you are kind of in an environment where you are overloaded, kind of primarily your response mode is to kind of react to all of that stimulation coming in, and to try and optimize how you're going to behave in response to that.
Mhm.
And but of course, our brain, you probably know about this very important system that we have called the default mode network. So the default mode network is a system within the brain that's really kind of geared towards what's referred to as internally oriented cognition. So not sort of cognition that's there to respond to what's happening coming in from the outside, but it's kind of more inner oriented. It tends to happen when you are mind wandering or daydreaming, and it opens up all kinds of new avenues for thinking that you would otherwise have no availability to. So, for example, another thing that we talked about earlier was creativity. So, there's been, about 20, 25 years of, I think, like really, really nice work on the neuroscience of creativity and how the brain sort of, supports that mode of cognition. And we know that the default mode network plays a very important role in coming up with creative ideas, especially in the early phase of creativity. So, when a person is kind of ideating and have like generating a lot of kernel ideas, you kind of want to have a relaxed state of mind that is broad in terms of attention, that can generate lots of potential ideas. And then later on, this other system called the executive control system, that's more like a control system, kicks in to sort of prune those ideas and select what's best for task completion. But in that early phase, it certainly is very beneficial to kind of like broaden your attention, through the engagement of the default mode network. And this is, for example, where design could have an important role to play, because you if you're trying to promote creativity, you essentially want to have the person in a state, and of course that can be facilitated via the environment, where the attention is not kind of entirely drawn to dealing with kind of incoming stimuli, but a person is giving an opportunity to kind of really explore internal thoughts. And there, I think, kind of all kinds of interesting issues come into play. So, for example, what's the right level of arousal? Okay, so the historically in psychology, it's always been sort of like there's this optimal sweet spot, but we also know that there are lots of individual differences in kind of where that optimal sweet spot might be. And one of the kind of, for example, personality factors that's been studied a lot in this sense is extroversion. Okay, so
Mhm.
kind of extroverts and introverts engage in kind of different levels of effort in seeking stimulation, and this might have something to do with the fact that maybe their internal kind of homeostatic sweet spot varies, with introverts being at an already higher levels of kind of intrinsic arousal, and therefore not needing to go out there to accrue more, whereas kind of for extroverts it would work the other way around. So it
Yeah.
really brings in, personality,
Mhm.
environmental factors, kind of individual differences, kind of all coming in to impact this process.
Definitely. And what I'm hearing you say, so correct me if I'm wrong. What I'm hearing you say is you can use kind of, where neuroaesthetics is right now. We know that having, open higher ceilings, we know that. We know having contrast in space helps to open us up to creativity. We know that multisensory, having a space designed in a multisensory capacity, and to, as you're saying, that individual part is important. And so, I think kind of like, again, as we talked a little bit about in the previous conversation, where you kind of need to get a median out of that. You don't want to go, too far on either extreme. And so, it's kind of designing, but also, for people individually for their home, I always encourage people to test things out. This is really a really great way. I think you can use your home and your environment to really practice self development tools to understand yourself more. And then you can really understand not just what your home looks like or your workspace, but the types of spaces you really enjoy, like why you're drawn to them. And it can really enrich your life. And so, I guess what are there any other things that I haven't named that neuroaesthetics, from kind of like that contrast, the ceiling height, scale, lighting, helps to kind of open us up?
Well, one thing that you just mentioned right now, which I thought was very interesting, and I think it's unfortunately not studied enough, is these kind of spaces that we find ourselves in almost by accident that we notice right away having some kind of an impact on us that we find is noticeably different. So there's aspects of our space, for example, our home environment that we design specifically because we sort of, for example, know that there's a color palette that we might be responding to positively. So we try to populate our spaces with that. Or, we all kind of have differences in terms of kind of degrees of texture that we like, lighting that we like. But then oftentimes also we might find ourselves in an environment that we didn't necessarily choose ourselves, but that can be like a window into something that you would respond positively to. So for example, last week I happened to go to a library. So libraries were places we used to go to very, very often before, but it's become less and less often now because I mean, we do almost everything online these days. But I kind of was looking for like an old book that I was having difficulty finding. So I found myself in kind of like the old stacks of an old library at University of Toronto. And I remember kind of going into this space where you've got kind of beautiful kind of wooden furniture everywhere and kind of like these old stacks that are all made of wood. You have like very nice kind of calming palette within the space. And I found myself sitting there and I was overcome by this feeling of kind of how well this space was facilitating me being able to like read and
Mhm.
concentrate and focus. And I looked around and I was like, oh my God, I remember coming to these spaces a lot in the past, and I'd almost kind of like forgotten how certain features of this environment have such beneficial effects on the way I function, for the task that I was actually up for at the moment. So I think being able to, kind of take notice of those things and learn from them and then kind of like implement them into the spaces that you actually can design yourself, to a certain extent that can
Yes.
have a lot of value.
I thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I mean, I think that people can really use it as a personal development tool. It's a great way to learn about yourself and each other, as well. In terms of I'd like to talk a little bit about kind of pleasure and joy from a neuroaesthetic standpoint. Does neuroaesthetics distinguish between the brain's response to a space that offers more of like a fleeting aesthetic pleasure, kind of like a quick dopamine hit, versus cultivating deeper experiences of joy, meaning, and lasting well being?
Oh yeah, so this is a very good question, and this kind of goes kind of beyond neuroaesthetics to kind of like the psychology of aesthetics. So for a very, very long time, I would say the psychology of aesthetics was really sort of geared towards understanding kind of what I refer to as like simple fleeting pleasures, kind of these kind of mild feelings of kind of pleasant affect that have
Mhm.
basically a very short duration. And they kind of were in some ways consequence of the kinds of paradigms that were used for studying the pleasure that we experience when we're kind of having an aesthetic moment. For example, it would be a person looking at a visual scene for a brief moment of time and kind of like reflecting on how that makes them feel. It could be, for example, listening to a short segment of music, or it could be looking at an attractive face for a short period of time. But of course, also images of like architecture and design, kind of like
Mhm.
short exposures lasting a few seconds, and then looking at, for example, what's happening in the brain for a few seconds thereafter. So
Mhm.
a lot of this work, as we kind of like, I think we maybe touched on this before, clearly has implicated the brain's emotion and reward systems in how you respond to these stimuli. So we know that the reason why we have the reactions that we do to a large extent are driven by reward, emotion. Of course, pleasure plays a very, very important role. And pleasure plays a very important role for specific experiences, like, for example, beauty. So
Mhm.
there's been some really, really good work to show that, if I'm just sort of like telling you how much I like something, or if I'm telling you how much I prefer something, I can sort of generate that response without the need to experience pleasure per se. Okay. But we know that for something like beauty, that's sort of like higher order in some ways, pleasure is almost a prerequisite. You sort of
Mm.
need to experience that to be able to indicate that something is beautiful. Because beauty, for when people tell you that they find something beautiful, they kind of have typically almost like a template in their mind, like a mental representation that they're comparing what they're seeing to it. And
Mhm.
that to make that judgment, pleasure plays a very important role. But almost all of this work is about kind of like quick, fleeting sensations of pleasure. We are just beginning to gain some traction on sort of what you were referring to, which is kind of like this longer lasting effects. Okay. So, for example, and this can be for something like, you go to the museum and you interact with a painting that has kind of like a strong impact on you. But of course, it can also happen with architecture and design, where kind of your interaction with it is not like a fleeting in a sense of like, I'm going to look at an image for about maybe 2 or 3 seconds and
Mhm.
kind of tell you how beautiful I find this to be, but in a real interactive sense. Okay. So that work has begun to happen. So for example, with a lot of the fMRI work to date, the idea would be the person would go inside the fMRI scanner. They're shown images of, for example, a curved space for a few seconds, and a person will sort of like indicate kind of how beautiful they find that space to be. That's sort of one way to study it. But now people have come up with really kind of really clever experimental designs. So, for example, you can wear portable EEG devices. Okay, so EEG kind of it's kind of like a different way of collecting brain activity data, where you're kind of like looking at activity at the level of the scalp. Okay, so electrophysiological activity.
Mhm.
But the nice thing about EEG is that you can kind of have portable devices where you can kind of like collect data
Mhm.
across long expanse of time. So these are sort of really cool kits that people wear, and you have a portable EEG headset. And then, as opposed to having an image that the person can only look at for a few seconds, you can have the person kind of wear virtual reality goggles where they kind of navigate through a space. Okay, and now what you're doing is you're really kind of like expanding the temporal aspects of interacting with the space. And this kind of really allows for some of the effects that take longer to develop physiologically to really come online. And you can also have the opportunity to kind of study what's happening in the brain more than just a few seconds, but for like expanded periods of time. And I think a lot of this really, really exciting work will probably build on all the earlier work that's come that was kind of
Mhm.
more in some ways fixated on like fleeting temporary effects to give us a better sense of like the longer term effects.
That's it's fascinating. I think about it and I'm excited that more of these studies are happening just from the standpoint that everybody knows like you can get pleasure from things that are harmful for you. You can get and there's versions I think my personal hypothesis is there's versions of that in the interior environment, not just toxic wise, because I mean we literally know that that there are things in your interior environment that physically degrade your health, like VOCs, SVOCs, and that sort of thing. And that's just one layer. But, I think this deeper connection, which I would think is related to authenticity. And, I would think that it's these kind of studies, for it to have lasting joy would have some embodiment of authentic representation of yourself and connection with your spaces. And, I think that that would probably tie into the primal brain, obviously, that we all have in common, but then
Mhm.
those individual differences, like we talk about, like everybody is connected, but we're also individuals. And so I think it's fascinating, but I love that people are doing this work because beauty is amazing, but I think it's just peeling back the superficial. And, that's something I'm really passionate about in this industry is that it's not just about a fleeting thing that's beautiful. It's deeper. It has meaning.
Yeah, yeah. And there's been some really good writing in the last few years about, for example, kind of going back to what you said about kind of like choosing environments that have certain kinds of features that it's almost counterintuitive you'd be drawn to. But for example, the same questions have been raised, for example, with our love for like watching horror movies, or for example, listening to music that is kind of very, very sad, for example. So in some ways, this might seem counterintuitive, but a lot of these recent theories have sort of argued that there's a very important kind of homeostatic component to this idea, that we are kind of constantly kind of either consciously or unconsciously kind of regulating our homeostatic
Mhm.
states. And kind of an important aspect of that homeostatic state is, of course, our emotional state, and how we choose these environments to kind of like settle things to a level. Of course, it would vary from person to
Mhm.
person, but there is kind of, we kind of do know what the optimal range is for us individually, and we kind of know how to regulate that, you know. But another thing that is also very nice about, well, it's been proposed in relation to art, but I think also is important for something like architecture and design, is that the context also kind of affords a level of safety within which you can experiment with these
Mhm.
manipulations. So, you know, so for example, when you think about like horror movies, of course, the emotion that comes to mind immediately is fear. Okay, but this is maybe not something that kind of in our kind of evolutionary kind of past you might have really been in a position to kind of experiment with, because it would have detrimental consequences. But now in our evolved state, or relatively more evolved state, we kind of can find ourselves in environments, and it's, for example, can also be like an indoor environment where we are given the relative safety to experiment with things and see how manipulating things that in some ways might seem counterintuitive might actually have a beneficial impact on us
I
in a
love that
short-term
you're
basis.
bringing this up. I love that you're bringing this up. I've been exploring this concept for home environments, but also for therapeutic environments, because there are also, I think like different types of psychologists and therapists can really use their environment to kind of help facilitate the healing process. And so what I'm hearing you say, I refer to them as kind of like rooms for emotional alchemy. And I think I have a spiritual teacher, and he told me, based on his, and I mean, this is on the spiritual side, but I find it fascinating how how science and spirituality can merge
Mhm.
and use different terms sometimes. But he told me that he has a fear room, and he uses this fear room to, based on his beliefs, that it helps to kind of neutralize that energy in us. And for a spiritual path, it's a specific spiritual path that he's on. And then on the therapist side, like we're talking about, through exposure, like we literally have exposure therapy to help people move through things.
Mhm.
And I'm really fascinated with this idea, especially for, stress and anxiety is on the rise for the population as at large. I think I mentioned in our previous session that I am someone who dealt with anxiety for decades. And one of the major tools that I am an advocate for is hypnotherapy. I am a huge advocate for hypnotherapy, but it's what we're talking about here is kind of like it's around evoking a feeling to help
Mhm.
you transmute it and get back to kind of an equilibrium, this homeostasis that we're talking about. And so I'm really excited to hear that that there's more work being done into this, because I feel like that area will kind of, I feel like it's going to explode more, and it'll help change people's relationship with feelings too, because feelings don't have to be bad is the point. You don't have to push away bad feelings. There's actually like a lot of benefits health wise to kind of moving through things, neutralizing them to gain more balance.
Yeah, yeah. And in the area of neuroaesthetics, for example, one theme that's become a major source of study, well, you know how it is. This it's not that it wasn't really a source of study before, but it's kind of come way more into center stage. Is kind of, so we have if you look at the history of this area, like a lot of the work has sort of focused on, well, let's see what's happening in the mind and the brain when a person is interacting with an object that has an aesthetic quality. Okay, so
Mhm.
the person starts interacting, and then let's see what's happening thereafter. But a lot of current work is about, well, what's really motivating the person to begin that engagement process to begin with? So, for example, with art, it will be, well, what is that sort of like prompts you to go to a museum, your
Mhm.
motivational state? For something like architecture and design would be, for example, what are some of the motivations for manipulating aspects of the environment that you find yourself in for kind of specific end goals? And one theme that's emerged in a major way here is kind of meaning. Is that so with art specifically, but of course you can kind of expand this to other kinds of aesthetic phenomena. We we may interact it for lots of different reasons, but it's really ultimately for meaning making. Okay, so we're
Mhm.
trying to kind of understand ourselves in relation to that work, and the kind of you can think of that work as almost as a vehicle
Mhm.
that facilitates that process. So there's, for example, models where a work of art is seen as a communicative medium. So there's a creator who makes a work, and you can think of this work as being almost any kind of phenomena that's a human artifact of some sort. Okay, and then you've got a kind of a person on the receiving end who's kind of interacting with that. And the idea would be that in the course of your interaction, you kind of understand yourself better,
Mhm.
and you also infer some aspect of the initial intention that brought that work to be. Okay, so ultimately you kind of come out of that process having learned something. It's kind of, so you have a
Mhm.
emergence of learning on the back end. Okay, and I find that to be a very helpful kind of framework for this overall space, because it's very generalizable. A lot of the interactions that we have at a superficial level may not really seem like they're about kind of meaning making and
Mhm.
learning. But as organisms, this is how we survive. We have to learn and update our models. And it doesn't only happen when you're kind of like consciously aware of it, but also when you're not.
I find this fascinating. I love the way that you're describing it, and I think what I keep hearing is spaces, whether you recognize it or not, they you are personally developing, you are growing through every experience you have. So, which again, brings to the forefront intentionally designing spaces and having spaces that are positive for your overall health and well-being, and promoting growth in a way that's healthy, because you can have experiences obviously and you come out the other end, and it can be detrimental to you. So it's really kind of shining a light on that aspect too, and I think helping people take into consideration just how serious it is, just how important it is, just like all other aspects of health and well-being. So thank you for your work in this. This is exciting. This is exciting. Um, what's one of the most common mistakes that you see people or even designers make when creating living spaces from a neuroaesthetic viewpoint? It might be subtly undermining well-being or joy.
Okay, so that's a difficult question to answer. Partly because, well, it's really for two reasons. So it's difficult to answer. Firstly, because I think most of these spaces are designed for a very specific task in mind, or a very specific activity in mind, and there are a lot of individual differences in how people kind of respond to these spaces. So I can give you, for example, like a basic example to drive this home. So if you remember a bit earlier, we talked about this work that we had done that had shown that there are kind of like a limited number of factors that determine our preference for spaces. So if you remember, there was this coherence idea, like does the space kind of make sense? There's this fascination idea, well, is there something interesting here for me to explore? And then there is the hominess aspect. Does it sort of feel kind of cozy and comfortable? And these three things together drive our preferences for the spaces that we find ourselves in. But there are lots of individual differences in how sensitive we are to these factors. So we did this study a few years ago where we compared like a standard neurotypical sample,
Mhm.
kind of like a representative sample drawn from the population writ large, or it was students who were kind of in a design program at the university that are sort of in terms of first principles probably more sensitive to design features. And then we also had participants who from autism spectrum disorder, from
Mm.
that spectrum. Okay, so the idea there is that each of these particular groups has certain kinds of probably generalizable tendencies that might impact their sensitivity to something like coherence, fascination, hominess. And the one that we were very, very interested in for participants from the autism spectrum disorder spectrum is, for example, their sensitivity to interpersonal distances and interpersonal spaces. Okay. And we found that, these spaces that, for example, people in a neurotypical group found kind of preferential or their preferred were not the same as people who were in the autism spectrum disorder space, or even people who were kind of trained formally in architecture and design at the university. So this uh, kind of creates a bit of a conundrum for a designer. So if you're, for example, going to design a particular kind of space, what you really need to do is you need to be kind of really aware of the needs and the characteristics of the end user.
Mhm.
So this is one thing that I think typically, when you have in terms of kind of optimizing a space, it's all kinds of different factors that come into play. In my humble opinion, I think having a good understanding of who the end users are and kind
Mhm.
of trying to optimize it for that particular group is probably a very good idea. The other thing that also comes into play, which of course is kind of more difficult to implement, is kind of having features to the space that are in some ways flexible. And here's what I mean by that. So we talked about something as subtle as ceiling height having an impact on how kind of abstract you can think versus how concrete you can think. So this research that had shown that a room with like a higher ceiling promotes kind of more abstraction in thought. And this is, of course, something that we know had also been shown to benefit in that study, kind of divergent thinking and creativity. And then you kind of have people in lower spaces become more concrete thinkers, and there's specific kinds of cognition that can really benefit from that. So when I say concrete, people tend to think, oh, that's not good. I'm like, actually it can be very, very good depending on what the activity is. So for example, if you had like a space that I find myself in quite often is, for example, a university department that has different kinds of classes, that classroom spaces that are used for teaching different kinds of classes, and for engagement in different kinds of activities. It'd be very good to have some kind of a flexible setup where, for example, you've got some rooms that are kind of higher in ceiling versus those that are lower, that are booked for different kinds of activities. And you can see this would be beneficial not only, for example, at the university level, where, for example, you might have like a creative writing class, for example, but even at elementary school level, with children, who are engaging in different kinds of activities, to have something as basic as ceiling height manipulated
Mhm.
for the kinds of activities that they would enjoy engage in.
I love that answer. Thank you. So, what is the most exciting unanswered question for you right now in neuroaesthetics on how interiors can unlock deeper human experiences?
Okay, so the more kind of one of the big holy grails right now that I think a lot of different labs are going after, which I'm also very, very interested in, but I was certainly not the first person to highlight this question, is this idea that you can kind of like think about your brain as almost like a kind of like a hierarchical system where information flows through it until you have a conscious experience that can then drive behavior. So we now sort of have kind of begun to gain some traction on some of the basic sensory and perceptual regions of the brain that are sensitive to different kinds of environmental features. So some of the ones that we've talked about. So for example, curvature or ceiling height, or the extent to which a room seems open versus enclosed, but also things like, for example, complexity and texture and contrast. And we kind of know that we have these sensory and perceptual kind of regions typically that are sensitive to these specific features. But what we don't really have an understanding of fully is the cascading of the processes that go from this sensory perceptual phenomena, link up with the reward region, and then go to kind of higher order areas in the brain that become kind of deeper conscious experiences.
Mm.
This, I think, is one of the kind of major outstanding questions. So in other words, when a person tells you, you know I find this particular space beautiful, or I find this particular design feature beneficial to my well-being, what is the cascading of the processes kind of neurologically or psychologically that brings that about? Okay, this, I
Mm.
think, is one of the major outstanding issues.
That's interesting. And especially, based on what like part of the conversation we just had about how individuals are constantly looking through homeostasis. So there's a large, but then collectively. So I'm assuming there's a collective part of that culture, different countries, worldwide, and then there's the individual. And that's some fascinating research. I'm excited to follow along.
Yeah. No, it's I mean, like, one of the systems in the brain that we have been obsessed with for a long time is, for example, the reward system,
Mhm,
because this seems to be such a critical component of the emergence of that pleasure response and what
mhm.
we tend to like ultimately. But of course, there's huge amounts of input coming into that from sensory and perceptual systems. And we don't really understand how, once all that input comes into the reward system, it's sort of made coherent and then fed forward for you to have a conscious experience of, I find that space beautiful. This is a very it's a critical question, but I think this is one of the major we're just beginning to gain traction on this question. I find that we're much further than we were maybe 20 years ago, but still quite a ways to go.
Well, that's exciting. So, where can listeners learn more about your research or any other publications or projects that you're part of?
One really good way to learn about this work is, well, of course, I have to promote this association that I'm a member of. It's called the International Association of Empirical Aesthetics, IAEA. So this is sort of a group that meets every other year, and it's a really great interdisciplinary group of, psychologists and philosophers and neuroscientists, all of whom have one interest in common, which is trying to understand the empirical basis of aesthetic phenomena. We
Mm.
have really good representation now from a lot of researchers and practitioners who do work on architecture and design. And, we meet every other year. And our next meeting is happening next year in Germany in May. So if you have time and you want to browse the internet, IAEA, the International Association of Empirical Aesthetics, would be a great resource to go to for updates about events of this kind. Another organization that will also be of interest is, so there's of course the American Psychological Association, but the American Psychological Association is different divisions, and Division 10 is one of the oldest divisions within APA. It's a really great gathering spot for people who do work in aesthetics, psychology, and creativity. Okay, so those would be kind of like the two main places to go for learning more about this area.
Thank you. I was asking for my listeners, but I didn't know about these places either, and I'm thinking I should probably join them
Okay.
since my work focuses on on this.
Yes, yes. And there's another really good lecture that's actually coming up for the Academy of the Neuroscience of Architecture that's entitled Designing Spaces to Support Creative Thinking. And I think this particular presentation is scheduled for June 20th. If you look under ANFA, ANFA, and the speaker for this particular session is Sally Augustine.
Oh,
And
I
again,
interviewed her before.
yes, exactly. So the lecture is entitled "Designing Spaces to Support Creative Thinking." So I think if you found this chat interesting, you might be interested in that one also.
Yes, thank you. And actually, we had a lot of really positive interaction with that episode from the podcast. So I'm sure a lot of people would be interested to tune in for what she has to say there. She is just a vast, knowledgeable person in environmental psychology. I love her. She's very sweet.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. I am excited to get this out there for everyone. And I think people are going to love it. And I think a lot of people are more and more interested in neuroaesthetics, which I'm super excited about too. So
Yeah, yeah, I feel the same way. And it was really wonderful chatting with you, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
thank you. That's it for this episode. Please remember before you go to subscribe below. You can also check us out on Instagram at The Aligned Interior or our website, thealignedinterior.com. The Aligned Interior services are also available for hire. So if you have a residential, commercial, or a hospitality project, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us at info@thealignedinterior.com. Until next time, be well.